I already signed the listing agreement on Friday. The realtor's coming Monday at 10 to photograph the house. And I had to get you new keys cut because I cannot let you give this $340,000 property away to that church." Those were the first words Darnell Simmons spoke to me through my cell phone speaker while I was standing in the parking lot of Shiloh Baptist Church in Vicksburg, Mississippi. The sky above the parking lot was clear blue. The heat was starting. My purse was still slung over my shoulder, my shoes still carrying the dust from the front steps where I had just said goodbye to Corinne Mallory after morning service ended at 12:15. We had sung 3 hymns and heard a sermon about faithfulness that I would have paid better attention to if I had known what was waiting for me in my driveway. I am Loretta Mae Simmons, 61 years old. I had spent the last 38 years as an elementary school librarian at Vicksburg Unified School District, teaching 3rd graders how to find what they were looking for in the stacks, how to ask questions of a book, how to move through a library and then through a world with the confidence that information was power and that power belonged to them. When they handed me a retirement watch in 2019 and told me to go find something to do with all that time, I thought about that carefully. What I found was time itself. I found it in a burnt orange Buick with 112,000 miles on the odometer. I found it in Sunday mornings at Shiloh Baptist, sitting 2 rows behind Corinne Mallory, a woman I had known since 1985. Since the year my daughter Renata was born, and Corinne brought me a casserole that had actual meat in it and did not pretend grief could be seasoned away. I found it in the certainty that no one, not my son, not a bank, not a real estate agent wearing a blazer that cost more than my monthly grocery budget, was going to tell me what to do with $340,000 worth of property that I had spent the last 28 years paying for. Every single month, while my husband Bernard worked his shift at the plant and then came home and worked his second shift on the things this house needed, right up until the day he died in his sleep at the age of 70, 4 years after I finally paid off the last dollar of the mortgage. Darnell's voice kept coming through the phone speaker. He was 34 years old, and he worked in commercial property management for a firm called Vantage Group Realty. That meant he made his living finding properties that other people owned and figuring out how to move them around for a percentage fee. Apparently, he had decided to start practicing on the property his mother owned. I had a realtor come out and do a comparative market analysis, he was saying now. The house appraised at $340,000 in this market. Do you understand how much equity you have sitting in that place? Do you understand how exposed you are financially? What I understood was that Darnell had been looking at my bank statements, or my daughter Renata had forwarded them to him, or he had asked her to ask me, or some combination of careful pressure that I had watched him deploy since he was 9 years old, and first realized that his mother's patience was not the same thing as his mother's permission. I understood that my son was in financial trouble, and that his girlfriend Camille was probably in his ear about the mortgage on whatever apartment they were renting on salary that was only ever going to take him so far. What I did not understand, not in that moment standing in the parking lot with the phone pressed to my ear, was how far he was willing to go 2 weeks before this phone call. I'd sat at my kitchen table with Darnell and told him about the Shiloh Baptist Capital Building Fund. The church was trying to raise money to renovate the sanctuary, a new roof, new HVAC system, repairs to the foundation that had been waiting for 12 years. The building had been there since 1952. I had been inside it for the last 28 years. I had decided to pledge $50,000 from my estate to that work because I could afford it. Because my pension of $38,400 a year was enough to live well on and to give generously. And because the church had been the place where I sat every Sunday after Bernard died and did not say a word for 6 months, and nobody told me I was being dramatic, or that I should pray harder, or that time would heal what had been broken. They let me sit. When I told Darnell about the pledge, his jaw did the thing it has done since he was a boy. The same tightening at the hinge that meant he felt money leaving the family, and he was trying very hard not to say what he actually thought about it. "Mama, that is excessive," he had said. Not, "Mama, that is generous," or, "Mama, I respect your choice." Excessive, like I had promised the church the deed itself, like I had taken leave of my faculties, like an older woman with her own mind was the same thing as an older woman with a failing mind. He had been calculating even then. I saw it happening on his face. The math of an estate he was already spending, an inheritance that was not yet his, a future he had decided was his to control. I listened to him finish his current speech about protection and prudence, and his concerns regarding my giving away the property to Shiloh Baptist. He said it exactly that way, giving away, as though I had not framed that house with my own hands, alongside Bernard, as though the deed I had paid for with money, earned over 28 years of working in a school library, was somehow his to protect, instead of mine to dispose of. He invoked my age. He mentioned that I lived alone now, that I was isolated, that my thinking had become clouded by sentiment. He used the phrase declining judgment in a sentence so casual it sounded like an observation instead of a diagnosis. "I cannot let you do this," Darnell said. "You're not thinking clearly." I did not correct him. I did not explain. I did not invoke the 3 degrees I held. The classroom of 40 students a year for 38 years. And the fact that I managed my own finances and had never missed a mortgage payment and had built something substantial enough that my own son was willing to commit the fraud of signing the listing agreement without my signature just to get his hands on it. That was the piece that moved the conversation from overreach to crime. The listing agreement required my signature. And Darnell had signed it anyway. And Page Hollister Advantage Group Realty had accepted it without asking a single question about whether the woman who owned the house was the same as the man who had ordered the work. What I did was listen to him finish, and when he stopped talking, I told him I would see him at dinner on Sunday. Then I hung up the phone. My hands were not shaking. This is the thing I need to be clear about from the start. There was no moment of shock, no gasping or sitting down hard in a pew, no loss of composure. There was understanding, and then there was calculation. And my mind had moved from one to the other faster than my mouth could have formed a response. I put the phone in my pocket. I picked up my Bible bag. I walked toward the burnt orange Buick parked in the lot, where the sun was reflecting off the hood and making the air shimmer above the parking lot asphalt. My heart was beating normally. My breathing was normal. I was already thinking 3 moves ahead. The drive from Shiloh Baptist to my house on Magnolia Drive took 12 minutes. Miss Estelle Beaumont was standing on her own porch next door. The one she had been standing on every Sunday for 24 years. Since the week I moved in and she came over with a plate of fried chicken to tell me the names of all the plants in my front garden and which ones would die if I looked at them wrong during a summer drought. She was 78 years old, and she had been a teacher like me. Elementary school. Like me, before she retired, and spent the next 2 decades being the eyes and ears and conscience of our neighborhood. She knew exactly what I looked like when I knew something had shifted in the world. I stood in front of my own front door with a key in my hand, and the key would not turn. Not a sticking lock, not a problem that a little WD-40 would fix. The lock had been changed. Someone had called a locksmith while I was singing hymns 2 blocks away, and that person had instructed the locksmith to replace the cylinder, and the locksmith had done it without asking a single question about whether the woman who owned the house was the same as the man who had ordered the work. My Miss Estelle later told me the locksmith truck had pulled into my driveway at 10:08 a.m. She had looked at the clock on her kitchen wall. She had noted the time because there was something about the way the truck was parked on the grass, about the casualness of that violation that had offended her sense of order. I must have stood there looking at the locked door for 30 seconds. Miss Estelle was watching me from her porch. I turned to her without opening my mouth, and she came down her steps without me asking. She went back up them, and she came down again with a key of her own, the spare I had given her in 2001, during the period of time that I learned to think in terms of contingency. I had given her the key that year because an ice storm had knocked out the power and Bernard was working a double shift, and I needed someone to know where the spare key was. Someone I could trust to keep it without treating it like a secret, or calling me every 6 months to ask if I still needed it. I had said, "This is for ice storm and hard times." Miss Estelle had nodded and put it in her Bible and had not mentioned it again in 25 years, which meant when I needed it, she knew exactly where it was and what it meant. She opened my front door now without saying anything, and she stepped aside. The kitchen was not mine anymore. My table, which should have been scattered with the Sunday edition of the Vicksburg Post, and the church bulletin, and my reading glasses, and the cup of coffee I had made that morning with the real vanilla extract, not that imitation mess, was cleared completely bare. The small basket where I kept my Bible, the one Corrine had given me for my retirement, leather binding with my initials tooled into the corner, had been removed. Someone had taken it. The counter where I set fresh flowers every Friday morning was stripped bare. The windowsill where I keep the photographs, Bernard in his army uniform from 1979, Renata at her college graduation, Darnell at his first day of high school when he still smiled without calculating, was empty. A single piece of paper sat exactly where my Bible had been, printed on Vantage Group Realty letterhead. It was titled Consultation Checklist and Staging Recommendations. Darnell had been very thorough. He had noted the light exposure from the south-facing windows and recommended that I remove the lace curtains I had been hanging in that window for 15 years, because they obscure the natural light and suggest an older aesthetic that is not conducive to marketing to the millennial demographic. He had calculated the sightlines. He had walked through my house, the house where he grew up, the house where he learned to tie his shoes, and where I taught him to read before he got to school, where he had stood in the kitchen in his high school football uniform while I made fried catfish and told him I loved him no matter what he decided about college. And he had written down that the room photographed better without what he labelled excessive religious material visible to prospective buyers. My Bible, apparently, did not photograph well. There was a note at the bottom of the checklist, in Darnell's handwriting. Mama, I had the locks changed for your safety. You can pick up your new keys Monday morning. The realtor, Paige Hollister, will be here at 10 a.m. on Monday to take photos for the listing. I have invited Camille and Renata to review the listing with us. I am doing this to protect you and your interests. Please do not fight me on this. This is for the best. The casual cruelty of it was not in what he had written. It was in how carefully he had written it. How the language had the texture of something he had practiced. He had prepared for the possibility that I would object. He had prepared arguments, talking points, a narrative in which his theft of my property was reframed as protection. That was worse than simple anger. That was calculation masquerading as care. I picked up the checklist and I read it once. Then I read the note. Then I set both of them down on the counter where they had no business being. And I did not touch them again. My hands were still steady. I went to my bedroom. I opened my dresser, the same dresser where I had kept baby pictures and insurance documents, and the handkerchief Bernard had carried in his uniform pocket the day he came home from the army in 1979, and never carried again because he said the war had stayed overseas, and he was not bringing it home to me. I took out my Bible bag, the one Corinne had given me for my retirement. Leather and real linen lining. I reached into the inner pocket. The one I had specifically asked Corinne not to stitch closed. And I felt for the laminated card. It was there. I had put it there in 2009, during the 18 months when Bernard's will had to be probated. And I discovered very quickly that love and protection are not the same thing. The card was laminated because I had been to the copy centre on Main Street and I had said, "Can you laminate this?" And the girl had done it without asking why a woman would carry a lawyer's business card around in her Bible like it was a prayer. Maybe she understood. Maybe she had seen her own mother do it. The card said, Vivian Tate, estate attorney, Tate and Monroe Law. Underneath, in smaller print, was her direct cell phone number. She was a black woman about my age, maybe a year or two older, and she had guided me through the paperwork when everything I thought I understood about my marriage had to be converted into probate documents and court filings. She had been patient. She had asked good questions. But more than that, she had listened when I told her I was afraid. That I was afraid Darnell would try to take the house after Bernard died. That he had always been careful with money in a way that looked like love, but felt like control. And that I needed to know the house would be safe. She had looked at me and said, "Then we make sure his name is not on that deed. We do it right now. While you are still living, we do not take any chances." I had made sure I had paid cash for the house with Bernard, never took out a second mortgage, never refinanced, never put his name on it after I realized what control looked like in a man who was scared and grieving. When Bernard died, the house came to me clean. No probate, no complications, no ambiguity about who owned what. The deed was filed in my name alone. Loretta Mae Simmons. That deed was everything. I walked back to the kitchen. I sat down in the chair where my Bible bag had been sitting that morning. I picked up my cell phone. I dialed the number on the laminated card. Vivian answered on the fourth ring. The phone connection was clear enough that I could hear breathing in the background. Maybe a television, maybe someone else in the room with her on a Sunday afternoon, when she should have been doing something that was not answering calls from clients in crisis. But she answered anyway. That was the kind of person she was. "Loretta," she said, because she had my number memorized. "What has happened?" I told her. I told her about the listing agreement signed on Friday without my knowledge or consent. I told her about the key that would not turn in the lock. I told her about the locksmith truck that Miss Estelle had reported seeing at the house that morning at 10:08 a.m. when I was singing hymns about faithfulness. I told her about Darnell's 34-year-old voice telling me he was doing this to protect me, as if the $340,000 property that I had paid for was his to protect instead of mine to surrender. I told her he had changed the locks. I told her he had staged my house as though I were not going to be living in it anymore. I told her about the note. "He never added his name to the deed," I said. "No," Vivian said. "He didn't. He has no legal standing to list it." "No," Vivian said. "He doesn't." There was quiet on the phone. Not silence exactly. There was still breathing. Still the sound of that other room Vivian was in. Still the weight of what we both understood. A man had just committed fraud with his mother's property. And he had done it so smoothly, so carefully, with such a well-rehearsed narrative of care and protection that he probably believed every word he had said. "What do you need me to do?" Vivian asked. That was the question. Not, "Is this legal?" or "Can we fight this?" Just, "What do you need?" I told her. I told her I needed the estate documents revised before Monday at 10 a.m., when Paige Hollister was scheduled to take photographs. I told her I needed to move money around. I needed my will changed. I needed my assets reallocated in a way that would make it very clear what my intentions were, and who I intended them to be for. I needed my absolute right to dispose of my property reaffirmed in writing, notarized, signed, and sealed, so that when the next move came, because there would be a next move, I could calculate the timeline of it already. I could feel the pressure building. There would be no ambiguity about who I was or what I wanted. I also need, I said, a no contest clause. I need language that says if anyone files a guardianship petition against me, if anyone tries to claim I am incompetent or that my judgment is failing, the entire will goes to Shiloh Baptist. And they get nothing. There was a very small pause. "How fast?" Vivian asked. "Before Sunday dinner," I said. "It was 12:45 p.m. Sunday dinner was at 6. I had 5 hours and 15 minutes to make sure that if Darnell had already drafted a conservatorship petition, and I knew he had, I could feel it. I could calculate the way his mind worked because he was my son, and I had taught him to plan. That petition would be worthless the moment he filed it. "I'm going to call you back in 5 minutes," Vivian said. And then she hung up the phone. I sat at the table. Miss Estelle had gone home to her own house, but I could see her through the kitchen window, standing on her porch, the way she had been standing on that porch for 24 years, watching the neighborhood the way a librarian watches a library. seeing everything, forgetting nothing. I called Corinne and told her to bring her car to Shiloh Baptist at 1:45 p.m. When she started to ask questions, because Corinne has been my friend for 41 years, and she knows when something is wrong the way a person knows their own reflection, I said I needed her to sit in the passenger seat while I made some phone calls. And that was all I said. Somehow that was all she needed to hear. She said she would be there. She said she would bring her phone charger. She said, "How bad is it?" And when I did not answer, she said, "Never mind, I'll be there." Then I sat in my own kitchen, at my own table that someone else had decided to clear of anything that mattered. And I waited for Vivian to call back. When she did, for 4 minutes later, she did not waste time on reassurance or explanation. She said, "I can have the documents ready by 2:00. You need to come to my office, bring an ID, bring a witness. We will execute everything this afternoon." "I have a witness," I said. "Good," Vivian said. "Then we move fast." To understand why Darnell thought he could do what he did, you have to understand what that house meant. Not to him, to me. Bernard and I bought it in 1998 for $125,000. It was a 4-bedroom brick colonial on 2¼ acres at the end of Magnolia Drive, with white trim that needed repainting every 3 years, and a foundation that had settled on the south side so that every door in the house hung slightly crooked. The real estate agent called this character. Bernard called it a project. I called it mine the moment I walked through the front door and felt the light coming through the kitchen windows at 3:00 in the afternoon. We had Darnell by then. He was 3 years old. Renata came 2 years later, and for the next 30 years, that house was the center of everything we built together. Well, Bernard would come home from his shift at the manufacturing plant, and he would spend the evening fixing things, replacing boards on the deck, repainting shutters, sealing cracks in the driveway where water had gotten in and frozen and split the concrete open. He did this without complaint, without keeping a list of what he had done or what it had cost him in time or aching joints. He just saw something that needed fixing and fixed it. He was that kind of man, the kind who understood that a house is not an asset. A house is a promise you make every single day to keep it standing. I taught 3rd grade. I was the librarian. I made lesson plans and graded papers and spent my lunch periods helping kids who could not read at grade level figure out how the alphabet worked. I came home and I made dinner. Smothered pork chops, cornbread, candied yams, collard greens, the food that fed a family, and told them they were loved without me having to say it out loud. Bernard ate what I made and told me it was good. And then he went outside and worked until dark. The house had a good kitchen. That was what mattered to me more than anything else. A kitchen where light came in and where I could stand at the sink and see the back garden, where Bernard had planted tomato vines, and where the kids played in the summer grass. A kitchen big enough for Sunday dinner, for the meals that kept people connected to each other. That was what I was paying for. That was what Bernard was building. In 2009, Bernard died. He was 70 years old. We had been married for 33 years. He went to sleep one night and did not wake up. And I woke up to find my husband cold beside me and 17 years of mortgage payments still owing on a house that suddenly felt very large and very quiet. The bank was sympathetic. They were always sympathetic when you brought them a death certificate. But sympathy does not change the payment schedule. I had $217,000 remaining on a mortgage that required a 2-income household to service. I had a pension from 38 years of teaching, but I had not yet retired. Darnell was 26 and working at a mall managing a sporting goods store, a job where he wore a polo shirt and stood behind a counter and handled other people's money without ever once asking me how I was managing. Renata was 24 and still in college, finishing an occupational therapy degree with student loans. I had tried to help her cover, but could not afford to fully pay. Neither of them was in a position to help. The house was mine to keep or mine to lose. I kept it. For the next 2 years, I worked every hour of overtime the school would allow me. Summer reading camps, evening tutoring sessions, Saturday literacy workshops. Anything that added hours and therefore added money to the mortgage payment. I taught 3rd grade during the day, and I graded papers until midnight. I kept the house maintained because letting it deteriorate would have been allowing Bernard's work to rot away, and I was not going to do that. I replaced the roof in 2010 using the remainder of Bernard's life insurance settlement. A check for $23,000 that I had sat with for 3 months before I called a contractor, because I kept thinking he would have wanted to negotiate the price himself. The roof leaked in 3 places. It needed fixing. I fixed it. I paid the mortgage on time every single month. I did not miss a payment. I did not skip a month or ask for forbearance or restructure the loan. I paid what was owed. And in September of 2011, 2 years and 1 month after my husband died, I made the final payment, $196,947.83. I remember the number because I kept that payment receipt. The house was mine. No bank. No lender. No one else's name on the deed but mine. For the first time in my adult life, I owned something completely. The mortgage was gone. The weight did not lift. I do not think weight like that ever lifts. But at least now I owned the thing that was crushing me. That is when I should have put Darnell's name on the deed. That is when every conventional maternal wisdom would have told me to do it, to celebrate the freedom from the bank and to add my adult son's name to the property, a gesture of security, a signal of inheritance, a way of saying to him, "This is yours. This is what I have built, and because I love you, I am giving it to you." I did not do that. I had a reason, and it was sitting in my memory like a photograph I could not stop looking at. When Darnell turned 18, his father's company sent him a $4,000 life insurance settlement, a final benefit, a gesture of condolence to the children of a 35-year employee. Bernard had worked there since 1979. They sent Darnell a check in the mail. I asked him what he was going to do with it. He did not answer. I asked him again a few days later. Still nothing. 11 days after he received the check, the money was gone. I asked him where it had gone. He did not tell me. He said it was his money and his business, and I did not push him. I had always believed that a boy's money is his own, that he learns by making his own mistakes. So I let it go. But I watched him very carefully after that day. I watched the way he moved money around his own bank account, always checking the balance, always aware of what was there and what was not. I watched the way he asked me questions about what I was spending on the house, on groceries, on the electric bill. I watched him look at my bank statements when he thought I was not paying attention. He was keeping track of something. He was calculating. On the day the mortgage was paid off, the day I wrote the final check, I sat down with both of my children and I told them about my will. I told them that they would both inherit from me, that they were both my children, and that I loved them both equally. I told them the house would come to them both after I died, that the entire estate would be divided fairly, and that they would not have to worry. But I told Darnell specifically that his name would not be on the deed to the house. I told him that during my lifetime, the house would be mine alone to manage, to modify, and to dispose of. I told him that I had thought about this very carefully, and that this was my final decision. He did not argue. He did not cry or shout or tell me I was being unfair. He just got very quiet, and his jaw did that thing, the same tightening at the hinge that I had seen him do when he was 9 years old, and watching his father mow the lawn without him. The same expression that appeared whenever he felt something slipping away from him and realized he could not control it. "Mama," he said quietly, "I was just thinking about the future." "I know you were," I said. "That is exactly why your name is not going on the deed." After that moment, Darnell's relationship to the house changed in ways that were so small at first that I almost missed them. He still came home on Sunday afternoons. He still ate the food I cooked. But his visits took on a different quality. He would ask me how much I had spent on the roof. He would ask me what the property taxes were. He would mention in a casual way that he probably thought was harmless, that houses in the neighborhood were appreciating at a certain rate per year, and that I should really be thinking about my investment. He would note when I had the exterior painted or the foundation inspected. He was keeping an inventory. He was monitoring the asset. And I, foolishly, thought he was just worried about me, that he was taking on the role his father had left behind, that this was his way of showing love. I know now that was not what was happening. But I had spent 40 years being a patient mother. And patience, I was learning, is a form of blindness. At some point in his 30s, Darnell had gotten involved with a woman named Camille Price. She worked at First Covenant Bank as a loan officer, which meant she understood money in ways that Darnell probably found reassuring, or perhaps reassuring in the wrong way. Two people together thinking about assets and leverage and cash flow the way a couple thinks about it when they are trying to build something, but do not have quite enough to build it with. They had been together for 5 years. About 3 years ago, they had rented an apartment together, a nice place in one of the newer developments on the north side. 2 bedrooms, $2,100 a month. That apartment required both of their salaries. That apartment required them to be careful about money. And at some point, I think it was probably when they started talking about the future in a real way, when Camilla started asking about timelines and permanence and the things a woman asks when she is deciding whether to stay with a man, Darnell would have done the math. He would have calculated what his mother's house was worth. He would have thought about the equity, the location, the potential. He would have thought about what $340,000 could mean to a couple trying to make their lives stick together. And he would have started counting the days until that money became his, 2 weeks before the Sunday of the locked door. I had called Darnell and told him I wanted to have dinner at my house. A real dinner, family dinner. He said he would come, and he asked if he could bring Camille. Of course, I said. I wanted to meet her properly. I had seen her at a few family events, but I had never sat across a table from her for a meal. I wanted to know the woman my son had chosen. He came at 5 o'clock on a Sunday afternoon. He knocked on the door, his own mother's door. He knocked, and when I opened it, there he was at 34 years old, still the same boy who had gotten off the school bus at 3:15 and left his backpack in the middle of the kitchen floor. Still the same man who could not quite believe that his mother was a person separate from the role of mother. Still the man who was trying very hard to smile and to look like he was just coming by for a nice dinner. I had made smothered pork chops and cornbread and candied yams with the good yams from the farmer's market. The ones that come in late August and are sweet enough on their own without adding too much sugar. I had made a salad with greens from the garden. I had made peach cobbler with fresh peaches from a woman who sells them at the farmer's market on Saturday mornings. And I had made it the way my mother had made it, with the real vanilla extract. Not that imitation mess. Camille brought a side dish, something with Brussels sprouts that was very much not how anyone in my family had ever cooked Brussels sprouts. Which is to say, it had not been cooked in a cast-iron skillet with bacon fat, and I appreciated the effort, even if the result was not something I would ever eat again. We sat down at the table and we ate, and the light from the kitchen windows at late afternoon came across the table in that golden way it does in late summer. And for a moment, everything felt normal. Then I told them both about the church pledge over the main course. Shiloh Baptist is doing a capital campaign, I said. The building fund, new roof, new HVAC system, repairs to the foundation. The building has been there since 1952. I have been sitting in those pews every Sunday for the last 28 years. During the hardest times, that building held me up. I told them that I had decided to pledge $50,000 to that campaign. I told them the money would come from my estate. It was already written into my will. It was not money I was spending now. It was money that would come after I was gone. I said it plainly, the way you say something that is not negotiable. The table went very still. Camille looked at Darnell. Darnell looked at his plate, and his jaw did that thing. "Mama," he said quietly, after a moment, "that is excessive, not generous. Not, that is a wonderful thing to do. Not, I understand why that is important to you. Excessive. Like I had taken leave of my senses. Like the woman who had built this house with her hands, who had worked herself into her 60s to maintain it and pay for it, who had a pension of $38,400 a year and savings that added up to a comfortable life. Like that woman had suddenly become a spendthrift scattering money away to a church building when her son needed to think about the future. "It is my money," I said. "It is my decision." "I know it is," he said, "but it affects the family. It affects what you will be able to leave to us, to Renata and me. We need to think about this as a family decision." We. As if the money were already his. As if I were a committee that required consensus before I could dispose of my own assets. As if patience and love and decades of Sunday dinners had somehow made him the authority over what I did with the thing I had spent my life building. The pledge, I told him, is already in my will. It is already decided. It is already decided. You do not need to think about it, because it is not your decision to think about. I kept eating my pork chops. I did not raise my voice. I did not explain myself further. I simply returned to my meal and made it clear that the conversation was over. But I was watching him. I was watching the way his jaw tightened. I was watching the way he looked at Camille, some kind of signal passing between them. I was watching him calculate, and I understood, in that moment, that the time for patience was over, that my son had mistaken my composure for weakness for so long that he had stopped seeing me as a person and started seeing me as an obstacle, that he was going to make a move on the house, probably very soon, and that when he did, I would have to be ready. By the time we finished dinner, I had already decided what I was going to do. When I got back inside the house using Miss Estelle's key, the first thing I did was sit down. Not in the kitchen. That space felt occupied by the staging checklist and the absence of my Bible, but in the living room, in the chair by the window where Bernard used to sit on Saturday mornings with his coffee and the newspaper spread out on his lap. I sat there and I waited for my hands to stop being steady, which sounds strange, but it is the truth. My hands were steady, but they were also shaking, which is a thing that can happen when you are very calm and very frightened at the same time. The two cancel each other out on the surface, and everything looks normal. But underneath the wires are all burning. My laptop was on the coffee table. I opened it. I checked my email. There was a message from Renata. Her subject line said simply, "Mama, call me." Below that was a forwarded email. The forwarded email was from Darnell to Camille, and it had been carbon copied to Renata by mistake. Some small digital slip that was going to cost him everything. The forwarded email contained an attachment. I opened the attachment. It was a document titled Petition for Establishment of Conservatorship. It was 12 pages long. The document was drafted on Vantage Group Realty letterhead, which told me that Darnell had used his office computer and his company resources to draft a legal petition against his mother. At the bottom of page 1 was a signature block from an attorney I did not recognize. Someone who had apparently agreed to file this petition. Probably for a fee Darnell had paid with money that was not his to spend because it was not yet his to have. I read the document once, all the way through, without stopping. The petition described me as Loretta Mae Simmons, an elderly woman of the state of Mississippi who is subject to abuse, neglect, exploitation, and self-neglect due to cognitive decline and isolation. It went on to explain that I had indicated an intent to dispose of significant assets, approximately $50,000 of the estate valued at $580,000, against the express financial interests of her dependents, and that this disposal indicated a level of judgment that was no longer reliable. The petition requested that Darnell Simmons be appointed as my conservator, with full authority to manage my financial affairs, my medical decisions, my property, and my legal matters, pending a hearing to determine whether I was competent to manage my own affairs. The language was careful. It did not say I was incompetent. It did not say I had dementia or Alzheimer's or any cognitive condition that could be tested. It said my judgment was declining. It said I was isolated. It said I wanted to give money to a church, and that this desire indicated a problem that required intervention. There was a phrase that appeared on page 7, and I read it aloud to myself once, very quietly. An elderly woman with declining judgment who has indicated intent to dispose of significant assets against the financial interests of her dependents. Declining judgment. Me, a woman who had taught 3rd grade for 38 years. A woman who had managed a household, paid a mortgage, raised 2 children, navigated probate after her husband died, made conscious decisions about her will and her property and her legacy. Declining judgment. I set the phone face down on the coffee table. I got up and I walked to the kitchen. I filled a glass with water from the tap. Not filtered water, not bottled water. Just the plain water that comes out of the sink in a house you own and pay for. I drank all of it. The water was cold. It tasted like nothing. I filled the glass again and I drank that too. Then I picked the phone back up. I called Renata. She answered on the first ring. Mama, I am so sorry. He sent that to me by accident. He asked me to sign off on it, and I told him no, absolutely not. But he went ahead anyway. I should have called you immediately, but I wasn't sure. I didn't know if you would want. When did he send it to you? Asked. Thursday, she said. 2 days ago. He said he wanted my support before he filed it. He said he was worried about you and that this was the only way to protect your assets. Thursday. 3 days before the locksmith came. 3 days before the listing agreement was supposed to be photographed and posted online. Darnell had drafted this petition, had it reviewed by a local attorney, had sent it to his sister, and was probably preparing to file it the moment the Monday showing happened. The listing would establish that I wanted to sell the house, or rather, that I had agreed to sell it. The locksmith would establish that I had been locked out of my own home. The petition would establish that I had declining judgment that made me vulnerable to exploitation. A judge, looking at those 3 pieces of evidence in sequence, might very well conclude that an elderly woman with confused priorities needed someone to take care of her finances. The timing was perfect. It was airtight. He is trying to have me declared incompetent, I said to Renata. I was not asking. I was stating a fact. I know, she said quietly. He is trying to take control of my property and my money by convincing a court that I cannot be trusted to manage my own life. I know, Mama. Did you sign it? No, I told him I wouldn't, but he filed it anyway. Or he's about to. I'm not sure what the timeline is, but that's what he was planning. I understood something then. I understood that Darnell had miscalculated exactly one thing, and it was the only thing that mattered. He had thought his sister would help him. He had thought that if he framed this as protecting Mother, Renata would go along with it, or at least would not actively work against him. What he had not counted on was Renata's conscience overriding her need to avoid conflict. What he had not counted on was that she would forward the email to me with 2 words that sounded like an apology. Mama, call me! Those 2 words had just saved my life. Thank you, I said to Renata. I want you to listen to me. I am going to handle this. I am not going to let him do this, but I need you to not tell him that I know. Can you do that?" "Yes," she said. "Mama, I'm so sorry. I should have—" "You did what mattered," I said. "You called me. That is all that matters." I hung up the phone. I sat at my own kitchen table in my own house that I had paid for, that I owned. That was supposed to be mine to dispose of as I saw fit. And I calculated the timeline of a man who had decided that his mother's autonomy was less important than his own financial security. I calculated the moment he realized his mother was not going to be moved by guilt or sentiment or the promise of inheritance. I calculated the moment he decided to go to a lawyer and draft a document describing her as incompetent. The mortgage had been paid off in 2011. 15 years ago, I had made the house entirely mine. I had watched my son watch that happen, and I had seen him understand, in that moment, that he was not going to be given what he wanted. He was going to have to take it. For 15 years, he had been working toward this. The listing agreement on Friday was not the first move. It was the visible move. The petition. That was the end game. That was the move that would have worked if his sister had signed it. If I had not been in a church parking lot with my phone in my hand when he called. I understood what I had to do. I called Vivian Tate back. "I need to tell you something else," I said. I told her about the petition. I read her the language. Yet I told her about the conservatorship filing and the timeline, and the way Darnell had apparently been planning this for months. I told her that the listing agreement was not a spontaneous decision. It was a calculated escalation, a visible move that would support the invisible legal work he was doing behind the scenes. Vivian was quiet for a long moment. "A conservatorship petition," she said slowly. "And he's using the church donation as evidence of declining judgment." "Yes," I said. "He's clever," Vivian said. It was not a compliment. "If this had worked, if your sister had signed off on it, if you didn't find out about the petition until after the listing was active, a judge might have seen the pattern and concluded you needed intervention." "Can he still file it?" I asked. "Yes," Vivian said. "Probably. I would need to review the document to see if there are any procedural defects. But generally speaking, he can file a petition. But Loretta, listen to me. If you revise your will, if you do it right now, today, with proper execution and witnesses, and a no contest clause, and if that no contest clause specifically states that any conservatorship petition will trigger a complete disinheritance, he will think very carefully before filing." I understood what she was telling me. A no contest clause is a legal tool that says, if you contest this will, if you challenge it in court, if you file a petition that suggests I was incompetent when I made it, you lose everything. You get nothing. Not the house, not your share of the estate, not a penny. Darnell's original share of my estate was going to be approximately $406,000. That was 70%. He was going to get roughly 70% of everything I owned when I died, because he was my son, and because I had always intended to be generous to him. That is what I had written into my will when Bernard died. But if he filed a conservatorship petition, and if my will included a no contest clause triggered specifically by conservatorship filings, then he would get nothing. Less than nothing, actually. His legal fees to file the petition would come out of his own pocket with no hope of recovery from the estate. Renata's share, under the revised will, was being doubled to $174,000. The church was getting $50,000. The rest would be held in trust or distributed according to my instructions. Darnell would have a choice. He could file the petition and lose everything, or he could stand down and inherit $406,000. I knew which choice he would make. But first, I had to get the will revised. I had to get it executed with proper witnesses. I had to make sure it was ironclad and court-proof, because Darnell would definitely challenge it if he lost his inheritance over a legal move he had already made. How do we do this? I asked Vivian. How do we make sure he cannot touch this? The no contest clause is going to be the key, Vivian said. But we need to be very careful about the language. We need to make it clear that the clause is triggered specifically and only by a conservatorship petition or guardianship proceeding. We do not want to trigger it for normal estate disputes or will contest based on legitimate questions about your capacity. This is targeted. This is saying if you try to declare me incompetent, you lose your inheritance. Can you draft that? I can draft it in the next 30 minutes, Vivian said. But we need to execute it today, not tomorrow, today, and we need multiple witnesses, people who can testify to your mental state, your clarity, your understanding of what you are doing and why. I thought about Miss Estelle, standing on her porch, seeing everything. I thought about Corinne, who had been my friend for 41 years. I have witnesses, I said. Good, Vivian said. How many do you need? Can you come to my house? I asked. Can you bring everything you need and we execute the documents here, in my house, where I own the deed and where there is no ambiguity about my authority? Yes, Vivian said. I can be there in 40 minutes. I hung up the phone. I sat in the kitchen of the house I had paid for, and I understood, with a clarity that was almost restful, that my son had made a very serious miscalculation. He had assumed his mother was someone who could be managed. He had assumed that if he applied enough pressure, if he locked her out of her own house, if he staged the interior for sale, if he filed a petition claiming she was incompetent, so she would fold. She would hire a lawyer and she would negotiate. She would try to preserve the relationship. She would accept some compromise in order to keep her son. What he did not understand was that I had already made peace with losing him. The moment he decided to draft that petition, the moment he put his signature on a document describing his mother as incompetent, he had made a choice. He had chosen the house over the relationship. He had chosen the money over the truth. And I, in turn, had made my own choice about what I was willing to accept. I was not going to negotiate. I was not going to compromise. And I was not going to lose my house or my autonomy to a man who had confused his mother's patience with permission one too many times. I picked up my phone again and I called Corinne. When she answered, I did not waste time with preamble. I need you to bring your car to my house. I said, right now, if you can, and I need you to be prepared to be a witness to something. A witness to what? Corinne asked. To my sanity, I said. To the fact that I am fully capable of managing my own affairs and making my own decisions. There was a pause. Then Corinne said, I'll be there in 15 minutes. She was there in 12. While I waited for Vivian to arrive with the documents, I sat at my own kitchen table and I opened my laptop. I pulled up the email again, and the petition, the language, the signature block. I read it one more time. I read the phrase, declining judgment. And I did not flinch from it. I looked at what my son had done, and I acknowledged that I had seen the seeds of it for years. I had watched him keep careful track of my money. I had watched him ask questions designed to test my reasoning. I had watched him position himself as the voice of concern and care. But I had also chosen to believe, for far too long, that his control was just displaced grief. I had been wrong about that. But I was not going to be wrong about what came next. By the time Vivian arrived with the documents, by the time Corinne sat across from me at my own table as my witness, by the time I signed the revised will with its no contest clause carefully targeted at any conservatorship filing, I was not afraid anymore. The fear had burned away and left something clearer underneath. Clarity, certainty, the understanding that I had spent 61 years building something that was mine, and I was not going to hand it over to anyone just because they asked nicely enough or because they drafted the right legal documents. Darnell had wanted to know what his mother would do when her back was truly against the wall. Now he was going to find out. Corinne was waiting in her car when I pulled into the parking lot of my own house. She had been a postal worker for 32 years before she retired, which meant she understood logistics and efficiency and the value of showing up exactly when you said you would. She got out of her car the moment she saw the Buick, and she did not ask any questions. She just slid into the passenger seat and said, "What do you need me to do?" "I need you to listen," I said, "and I need you to help me read. Can you do that?" "Yes," Corinne said. I was still holding my phone. The battery was at 73%. I had Vivian Tate's number memorized from that laminated card I'd carried for 16 years, and I dialed it while sitting in my own driveway, staring at the house with its changed locks and its staged interior and its stolen future. Vivian answered on the 4th ring, and I did not waste any time with preamble. "Darnell drafted a conservatorship petition." I said, 12 pages. "It describes me as an elderly woman with declining judgment who wants to dispose of significant assets against the financial interests of my dependents. He's planning to file it, probably tomorrow or Monday, as soon as the listing is active and the house is photographed. I need my will revised immediately. I need a no contest clause that specifically targets conservatorship filings, and I need it executed today. Before he files anything." There was a silence, not a shocked silence. Vivian had been through probate court and estate disputes long enough to understand what was happening. It was a calculating silence. She was thinking through logistics, through what was possible in the time we had, through the mechanics of getting documents drafted and signed and filed before the Monday deadline. "How fast can you get to my office?" Vivian asked. "How fast do you need me?" I asked back. 30 minutes, she said. "Bring 2 witnesses, people who know you, who can testify to your mental state. They need to be unrelated to you and to the disputed parties. They cannot be Renata or anyone Darnell might claim has a financial interest in the outcome. I thought about the people in my life. I thought about Miss Estelle, who had been watching my house and my neighborhood for 24 years. I thought about Corinne, who was sitting in the passenger seat of my car at that very moment, her hand already on my arm. "I have them," I said. The drive to Vivian Tate's office took 22 minutes. Corinne sat in the passenger seat with her phone, looking up Vivian's address, then looking at me with an expression I could not quite read. It was something between concern and recognition. It was the look of a woman who had known me for 41 years, realizing that I had been preparing for this moment long before it arrived. Vivian's office was in a small building on the north side of Vicksburg, the kind of professional building where lawyers and accountants and financial advisors kept their practices. We parked and we went upstairs. Vivian was waiting for us in a conference room with her paralegal and a stack of documents that were already formatted and nearly ready to print. "I drafted a template while I was waiting," Vivian said. She spread the papers across the table. "These are your current will and your current estate plan. I've made preliminary revisions, but I need to understand exactly what you want the no contest clause to say. This is the critical piece. Once we finalize this language, we execute immediately, and you will have legal protection before he can file anything." I sat down at the table. I looked at the documents in front of me, and then I began to dictate. The no contest clause I had in my head was not something I had recently developed. It was something I'd been thinking about for weeks, maybe months, ever since I realized that Darnell's questions about my finances were not curiosity, but inventory. It was something that had lived in the back of my mind the way a woman carries a prayer or a contingency plan. I wanted to say, I told Vivian, that if any person, whether named in this will or otherwise, and who files or initiates any guardianship proceeding, conservatorship petition, competency hearing, or any similar legal action challenging my capacity to manage my own affairs, that person forfeits any and all interest in my estate. They receive nothing, not a penny, not a single dollar of the $580,000 in total assets. Vivian was writing this down. Her paralegal was typing it into the computer, formatting it as legal language, translating my words into the precise terminology that a court would recognize. "The language needs to be specific," Vivian said. "We cannot make it so broad that a normal will contest triggers it. A will contest is a legitimate legal action. What we are protecting against is a conservatorship petition filed under the guise of protecting you from yourself. Does that distinction matter to you?" "Yes," I said. "A will contest is fighting over what I want to do with my money. A conservatorship petition is claiming I cannot be trusted to make my own decisions. Those are different things." "Exactly," Vivian said. She looked at her paralegal. "Language should specify any guardianship petition, conservatorship petition, competency hearing, or capacity evaluations initiated by or with the knowledge and consent of the named party, filed within." She paused and looked at me. "What timeline? How long after your death should this clause remain active?" I had not thought about that, but I thought about it now. Quickly! If Darnell filed a conservatorship petition tomorrow, and I died next week, would he still try to claim it was valid? Would he argue that the petition had been filed before the revised will took effect? "No timeline," I said. "Forever. If he files a conservatorship petition at any point, now, tomorrow, next year, 5 years from now, and then I die, and that petition is still on the docket, or has been litigated at any level, the clause is triggered. He gets nothing. Vivian nodded. She was already thinking several moves ahead. The second piece, she said. The distribution. If Darnell is disinherited by the no contest clause, where does his $406,000 go? That was a deliberate question. She was forcing me to decide, right now, how much of my son I was willing to cut away, and how much I was willing to protect. Renata's share doubles, I said, from $174,000 to $348,000. The remaining $58,000 goes to the church building fund, in addition to the $50,000 pledge already in the will. That is $108,000 total to Shiloh Baptist. The house goes to both of them in equal shares. Half to Renata, half held in trust, with the proceeds going to the church during my lifetime and to Renata after my death. I was speaking clearly. I was thinking in numbers and percentages and the precise mechanics of an estate. I was not thinking about the fact that my son had drafted a petition describing me as incompetent. I was thinking about the math. So, if the no contest clause is triggered, Vivian said, Renata receives $348,000 plus half the house, which is approximately $170,000 in equity, for a total of approximately $518,000. Darnell receives nothing. The church receives $108,000. Is that correct? Yes, I said. And your other financial accounts and retirement funds? Your pension? Divided the same way. I said, Renata gets the majority. The church gets a portion. Darnell gets nothing if he triggers the clause. But if he stands down, if he accepts the original will with its smaller inheritance and never files the petition, he still receives $406,000 from the estate. I could see Vivian calculating. She was thinking about what Darnell would do when presented with this choice. A man with $2,100 in monthly rent to cover. A girlfriend who wanted security. A financial situation that was already precarious. Would he throw away $406,000 in inheritance to file a conservatorship petition that might fail anyway? The answer was obvious. He would stand down. He would see the revised will with its no contest clause, and he would understand, finally, that his mother was not a person to be managed. I can have this drafted and ready to sign in 15 minutes, Vivian said. But I need you to understand what you are doing. You are telling your son that his choice has a consequence. You are telling him that if he tries to control you through legal means, he will lose everything. Are you certain? I looked at Vivian. Then I looked at Corinne, who was sitting next to me in that conference room. Her hand still on my arm. Her eyes very bright. I am certain, I said. The paralegal finished the draft and printed it out. It was 8 pages. Not the 12 pages of Darnell's petition, but still significant. Still legal. Still binding. I read every word. I read the no contest clause 3 times. I read the distributions, the specific dollar amounts, the names and the dates, and the exact language that would protect me from the man I had raised. Then Vivian called in 2 of her office staff. People I did not know. People who had no financial interest in my estate. People whose only job was to witness that I, Loretta Mae Simmons, was of sound mind and clear intention. I signed the will. Corinne signed as a witness. The 2 office staff signed as witnesses. Vivian notarized it. And in the space of 40 minutes, I had unmade the future Darnell had been building. But before I left Vivian's office, I did something else. I called Renata. Your brother is probably going to file a conservatorship petition. I told her, I have just revised my will to include a no contest clause that says if he files that petition, he loses his entire inheritance. He will receive nothing. You will receive everything he would have received, plus your original share. Do you understand? Mama, she started. Do you understand? I asked again. Yes, she said quietly. Good, I said. Then you can tell him, or you can let him find out when the documents are filed. Either way, he now has a choice. He can file the petition and lose $406,000. Or he can stand down and keep it. What he cannot do is take my house or my money or my autonomy. Not anymore. I hung up the phone. In the car on the way back to my house, with Corinne in the passenger seat and the air conditioning running, I asked her to read the no contest clause aloud. I needed to hear it spoken. I needed to know that it made sense, that the language was clear, that a future judge would understand exactly what I was saying. Corinne read it aloud, her voice steady, the legal language rolling off her tongue like she had studied law herself. Like she had been waiting her whole life to read this specific paragraph to her best friend. When she finished, she set the papers down in her lap and she went very still. You were already prepared for this, she said. It was not a question. Yes, I said. How long? Weeks, I said. Maybe longer. I kept thinking he would just ask me for money. I kept thinking if I explained enough times, he would understand that patience is not permission. But somewhere along the way, I knew he was not going to stop. I knew he was going to escalate. And I knew that when he did, I was going to need to be ready. That is why you asked me to bring my car, Corinne said. It was another realization dawning on her face. You already knew. You already had a plan. I had the shape of a plan, I said. I did not know the specific moment. I did not know it would be a conservatorship petition, but I knew I needed to be prepared. I needed to have Vivian's number memorized. I needed to have thought through the distribution of the estate. I needed to understand what would make my son choose money over control. Corinne was quiet for a long moment. Then she reached over and squeezed my hand. I thought I was coming here to help you survive this, she said. But you were always going to survive it. You were preparing to win. That was not quite accurate, but it was close enough. I had not known I was going to win. I had only known that I was going to fight. And that I was going to do it on my own terms. With my own mind. And with the full understanding of what was at stake. When we got back to the house, I parked the Buick in the driveway. The burnt orange hood reflected the afternoon sun. The house sat behind it, mine and locked against me, and soon to be fully and legally and irrevocably mine again. Thank you, I told Corinne. For what? She asked. For being here, I said. For reading the words. For understanding what it meant when you heard them. You know what I realized, Corinne said. When I was reading that no contest clause, I realized that you have been protecting yourself your whole life. Every decision you made, not putting his name on the deed, keeping that laminated card, thinking through the distribution of the estate, that was you, 40 years before this moment. Teaching yourself how to survive this exact thing. I had not thought of it that way. But she was right. Every choice I had made, every time I had said no to my son's requests, every time I had insisted on my own autonomy, had been a form of preparation. I had been building walls not out of anger, but out of the understanding that love and protection are not always the same thing, and that a mother's job is not to be managed by her children, but to stay standing long enough to pass something forward. That evening, Darnell came to my house at 6 o'clock. He knocked on the door, my own son knocking on his own mother's door because the locks had been changed, and he did not think he had the right to simply walk in. I opened the door and I let him in. I did not mention the listing agreement, or the locksmith, or the email I had seen. I simply looked at my son, and I invited him to dinner. He had prepared the meal himself. He had made candied yams and cornbread, and a roast that he knew I loved. The kind of thing he used to cook when he was trying to make me understand that he cared, that his controlling questions about my finances came from a place of love. He set the table. He poured water into glasses. He tried very hard to smile and to act like it was just a normal Sunday dinner, a normal family meal, just him and his mother catching up. And I sat down across from him, and I ate the roast, and the candied yams and the cornbread. And I did not say a word about the petition, or the revised will, or the fact that his inheritance now hung on a choice he had not yet made. I simply sat at my own table, in my own house, and I ate the food my son had prepared. And I waited for Monday morning to arrive. Because Monday morning, when Paige Hollister pulled up to my house at 10 o'clock with her camera and her briefcase, and her smile already deployed, she was going to find that the listing agreement was void on its face. A non-owner cannot list a property, and Darnell Simmons had never owned this house. The moment Vivian's office filed the revised will, Paige Hollister's appointment was going to be cancelled, and Darnell was going to open his email and see the documents and understand, finally, that his mother was not someone he could manage. But that was tomorrow. Tonight, I simply ate my dinner and I held my composure, and I sat with my son in the kitchen of the house I had paid for, in the place I had built, in the life I had spent 61 years making my own. And I did not let a single thing show on my face. Sunday dinner was at 6 o'clock. I had set the table the night before, using the good cloth, not fancy, just the cloth my mother had given me 40 years ago. A pale linen that showed every wrinkle but also showed that I cared enough to press it. I had placed the napkins beside each plate. I had put water glasses at each setting. I had done all the things a woman does when she is expecting her son and his girlfriend, and she wants them to understand that she is still standing, still in control of her own home, still the woman who decides what happens at this table. Darnell arrived at 5:45. He was carrying a dish, a green bean casserole that Camille had probably made, the kind with canned soup and crispy fried onions that sits heavy in the stomach and tastes like someone tried, but was not really trying. He also had the roast. He had cooked it himself, slowly, in a low oven, the way I had taught him. He set it on the counter in my kitchen, his hands moving with the confidence of a man who still belonged here. Still thought of this as his space, even though his name was not on the deed and had never been on the deed. "Mama," he said, coming toward me for a hug. "Everything smells good." "Thank you for the roast," I said, and I let him hold me, my own son, the boy I had raised, the man who had tried to sell my house without my permission. I held him back, and I did not let anything show on my face. Camille arrived a few minutes later. She was wearing a dress that probably cost more than my pension check. Something in a dark blue that was meant to look professional and also friendly. The kind of dress a woman wears when she is dating a man whose mother has money and she wants to make a good impression. She brought flowers, roses, nothing sentimental, just a decent bouquet that cost money, and said nothing. I put them in a vase on the sideboard, and I thanked her. "Your home is beautiful," Camille said, looking around the dining room. "How long have you lived here?" 28 years, I said. "I bought it with my husband in 1998. We raised our children here. It is the only home I have ever wanted." I said this plainly. I was establishing facts, laying groundwork. Camille nodded, and something flickered across her face. A recognition, maybe, of what was at stake here, of what her boyfriend was trying to do. Renata called as we were sitting down. She was in Atlanta. She said she could not make dinner, but she wanted to say hello. I put her on speakerphone for a moment, and we heard her voice in the dining room, asking how everyone was, making small talk with Darnell and Camille, like she was not sitting 3 hours away, thinking about a conservatorship petition. Like she was not one of the witnesses to her brother's betrayal. After I hung up, we ate. The roast was perfect. Darnell had cooked it exactly right. Tender enough that you could cut it with a fork. Seasoned with nothing but salt and pepper because the meat was good enough that it did not need anything else. The candied yams were sweet, made with the real vanilla extract, and the good yams from the farmer's market, the kind that had come in at the peak of their season. The cornbread was butter and cornmeal and nothing fancy. Just the way it was supposed to be. Everything on that table was made with care, made with the kind of attention to detail that says, "I love you," that says, "I'm thinking of you," that says, "I want you to know that I care about feeding you properly." Camille made conversation about her work at the bank. She asked me about my years teaching. She asked about the church. She was trying very hard to be pleasant, to be the kind of girlfriend a man brings home to show his mother that he has made good choices. But her hands were nervous. She kept adjusting her napkin. She kept glancing at Darnell like she was waiting for something. Darnell ate, and he did not say much. But he was waiting. I could see him calculating, choosing the moment. He was waiting for the right point in the meal, when it would feel natural to slide the conversation into harder territory. He was waiting for me to be satisfied enough with the food, grateful enough for the effort, soft enough in the moment that I would hear what he had to say without my defenses fully raised. I waited too. I took my time. I had eaten 3/4 of my roast and half of my candied yams before Darnell finally set down his fork and reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out the listing agreement. It was printed on Vantage Group Realty letterhead, the pages clipped together at the corner. He held it in his hand for a moment, looking at it like he was gathering courage, like he was about to say something he had practiced many times in the mirror. Then he slid it across the tablecloth toward me. "Mama," he said, and his voice was calm, rehearsed, the voice of a man who had prepared a speech and was now delivering it. "I need to tell you what I have done and why I did it. I signed a listing agreement on Friday. Paige Hollister from my office is coming on Monday at 10 in the morning to photograph the house. I am doing this because I'm worried about you." I did not pick up the listing agreement. I just looked at it, sitting there on the pale linen cloth. The words printed on the first page, visible even from where I sat. "I love you," Darnell said, and he meant it. I could hear the truth in his voice. He did love me. That was the tragedy of it. He loved me in the way he knew how to love, which was through control. "But you are not thinking clearly. You want to give $50,000 to the church. You want to dispose of assets that should be protecting you in your old age. I cannot let you do that. I cannot sit back and watch you make decisions that are against your own interests." He kept talking. He talked about the real estate market. He talked about property values and the equity I had in the house. He talked about my pension and whether it was enough to live on in retirement. He talked about financial security and family protection and all the language of concern. All the words that a man uses when he is taking away his mother's autonomy and calling it love. I listened to all of it. I let him finish his entire speech without interrupting. "Sir." I nodded once when he stopped talking, a small acknowledgement that I had heard him. Then I reached down into my Bible bag, the one Corinne had given me for my retirement, leather with my initials tooled into the corner, and I took out a piece of paper. It was folded once, protected by the care I had taken with it for so long. The deed to my house. Loretta Mae Simmons, sole owner. 1998. Paid in full as of September 2011. No other names. No co-signers. No ambiguity. I unfolded it carefully. I placed it on top of the listing agreement, right in the center of the tablecloth, where both Darnell and Camille could see it clearly. Then I looked my son in the eye, and I said, very quietly, "You cannot sell what is not yours." That was all. 7 words. No anger in my voice, no accusation, just a statement of fact, delivered with the same calm tone I had used to teach a classroom of 3rd graders how to read. You cannot sell what is not yours. It was an absolute. It was irrefutable. It was the entire world contained in one sentence. Darnell's face went very still. He looked down at the deed. He looked at the listing agreement beneath it. He looked at me. His mouth opened and closed like he was trying to find words, like he was trying to formulate a response, like he was trying to calculate a way around this obstacle that had just appeared on his own mother's dinner table. But there was no way around it. A non-owner cannot list property. It was not a matter of opinion or negotiation or gentle persuasion. It was a legal fact. The moment Vivian's office had filed the revised documents that afternoon, the moment the revised will had been executed and notarized and signed. The listing agreement had become a piece of paper with no legal standing. Paige Hollister's appointment on Monday at 10 o'clock had been cancelled by Vivian's paralegal at 4:30 that afternoon. The email cancellation was already in her inbox. The showing was not going to happen. Camille was staring at the deed like it was a live snake that had appeared on the tablecloth. I don't understand, Darnell said slowly. What do you mean I cannot sell it? The agreement is already signed. The realtor is already coming Monday. The deed is in my name alone, I said. Has been since 1998. You never added your name. You have no legal standing to list this property. The agreement you signed is void on its face. It means nothing. I could see the moment he understood. It was the moment his entire plan collapsed. The listing agreement meant nothing. The photograph scheduled for Monday meant nothing. The Conservative petition was probably being filed even at that moment. But if it was filed, if he pursued it, he would lose his entire inheritance under the terms of the no contest clause that was now part of my will. He had built a structure of legal moves and financial calculations. And his mother had dismantled it in 3 hours using a lawyer and a laminated card, and the simple fact that she had never, not for a single day, put his name on the deed. "What have you done?" he whispered. "What I had to do," I said. And that was when Corinne appeared in the kitchen doorway. She was wearing an apron, flour on her hands from the bread she had been keeping warm in the oven the whole time. The whole dinner. As if she had always known exactly how this moment would land, and she had wanted to have something to do with her hands, something to tend to, some small domestic task that would keep her present and useful without being visible. "Does anyone want more bread?" she asked, her voice warm and completely normal, like there was not a deed, an avoided listing agreement, and a conservatorship petition sitting in legal limbo on the table in front of us. I made extras. You know how people always want bread. And somehow, that simple question, that perfectly ordinary interruption, did more to end the conversation than anything else could have done. It was the sound of normal life asserting itself. It was Corinne Mallory, my best friend of 41 years, reminding everyone at this table that life would go on. Bread would be eaten. Meals would be shared. The house would stand. And I would still be in it. And Darnell would have to decide whether to accept his inheritance or whether to file a petition that would cost him everything. "Thank you, Corinne," I said. "Yes, I would like more bread." I took another slice of cornbread. I buttered it. I ate it. I did not look at my son. I did not acknowledge the way his hands were shaking, or the way Camille was very carefully not looking at him, or the way the entire structure of his plan had become visible to everyone at the table, and then crumbled like something that had never been real in the first place, outside on the porch of the neighbouring house. Miss Estelle Beaumont was sitting in her chair, the way she sat every Sunday evening, watching the neighbourhood the way she had watched it for 24 years. I did not need to see her to know that she had seen Darnell's car arrive. I did not need to see her to know that she understood something significant had happened today. She was the neighbourhood's long memory and its most reliable timestamp, if anyone ever asked. She would remember what time he came, how long he stayed, whether his girlfriend left with him or left separately, what his face looked like when he came back out that door. But for now, for this moment, the only sound was the clink of forks against plates and Corinne moving back into the kitchen, humming something low and church-like, a hymn she probably learned 40 years ago, the kind that plays in the background of a life and keeps time without announcing itself. Darnell left at 8 o'clock. He did not stay for dessert. He told me he was not feeling well, that Camille probably wanted to get home, that he would call me tomorrow. He stood up from the table like a man had been hit and was still trying to maintain his balance. He kissed me on the cheek. My own son, leaving my house without the house he had tried to take. He shook Corinne's hand. He did not look at the deed again. But I knew he was aware of it sitting there on the pale linen cloth. A piece of paper that had just cost him $406,000 and forced him to make a choice he did not want to make. After he left, Corinne helped me clear the table. We did not talk about what had happened. We did not discuss the deed or the listing agreement or the way Darnell's plan had unraveled in the space of 7 words. We simply cleared the dishes, washed them, dried them, and put them back in the cabinet where they belonged. The deed I folded carefully and placed back in my Bible bag. The listing agreement I set on the counter to deal with later. To shred, probably, to destroy. To erase from my house the way I had erased Darnell's legal standing to take it. You knew, Corinne said, as we were putting away the last of the dishes. It was not a question. I knew something, I said. I did not know exactly what, but I knew he was not going to stop. And I knew that when he made his move, I needed to be ready. And you were, Corinne said. Yes, I said. I was ready. That night, after Corinne had gone home, and I was alone in my house, I sat at the kitchen table where I had eaten dinner with my son and his girlfriend, and my best friend. I looked at the pale linen cloth with its small wrinkles and its permanent creases from being folded and stored and brought out for the meals that mattered. I thought about the 28 years I had spent in this house. I thought about the mortgage I'd paid, and the roof I'd replaced, and the foundation I'd repaired, and the walls I'd painted, and the kitchen I'd kept clean and organized, and full of good food and love. I thought about the choice I'd made not to put my son's name on the deed when he was 18 years old, and had spent $4,000 in 11 days without telling me where it went. I thought about the patience I'd extended to him for all these years. The belief that one more explanation would finally help him understand that his mother was a person, not a problem to be solved. And I understood that patience had saved me. The listing agreement on Monday morning was cancelled. Paige Hollister called Vivian's office to ask why, and Vivian's paralegal explained that the property owner did not authorize the listing. The property owner had revised her estate documents and added a no-contest clause triggered by any conservatorship filing. Paige Hollister was a professional. She understood what this meant. She also understood that her commission had just evaporated. Darnell never filed the conservatorship petition. He called me on Tuesday and asked if we could talk about a compromise. Some way to work this out. Some way to preserve the relationship while still protecting his interests. I told him there was nothing to compromise. The documents had been executed. The will had been filed. His choice was to accept his original inheritance of approximately $406,000 and move forward, or to file the petition he had drafted and lose everything. It took him 3 days to understand that I meant it. On Friday, he called back and said he was dropping the petition. He said he wanted to preserve the family relationship. He said he hoped that maybe someday I would understand that he had been trying to protect me. I did not argue with him. I simply said, "I hope you understand what just happened. I hope you understand that your mother is not someone you can manage." Then I hung up the phone and I went back to my life. The same house, the same kitchen, the same table where I would eat Sunday dinner, and where my son was no longer welcome if he could not accept that the woman sitting at the head of that table was the one who decided what happened there. The deed to my house was safe. My autonomy was safe. My peace was safe. And that was all that mattered. Monday morning came clear and bright. The heat was building. Late April in Mississippi, the kind of day where you could feel summer waiting in the wings, patient and inevitable. I woke up at 5:30, the way I had been waking up for 38 years of teaching, and I made my coffee in the kitchen where nothing had changed. The counter was clean. The Bible that Darnell's staging checklist had displaced was back on the table. The flowers I'd arranged on Friday were still holding. The roses beginning to drop petals the way roses do when they have been cut and moved around too much. At 9:45, I took my coffee out to the front porch and I sat down in the wicker chair that Bernard had bought me for Christmas in 1994. Dry. The chair had held up well. The wood was still solid. The cushions had faded, but they were comfortable. I settled into it with my cup, 2 sugars and a splash of cream, the way I always made it. And I waited. At exactly 9:58, a silver Lexus pulled into my driveway. It was the kind of car that announces itself, the kind a real estate agent drives when she has built a reputation and wants everyone to know it. The woman who got out was Paige Hollister, 40 years old, briefcase in one hand and camera bag already slung over her shoulder. The smile already deployed on her face like she had practiced it in the mirror that morning. She was a professional. She was prepared. She had no idea that the listing she was about to photograph was already void. She walked toward the porch, her heels clicking on the concrete. And she seemed genuinely surprised to find me sitting there with a cup of coffee and a piece of paper folded in my lap. "Mrs. Simmons," she said, and her smile wavered slightly. She had been told to expect an empty house, a house that would be vacant for the photographs, a house that could be presented as pristine and untouched and ready for new owners. "I'm Paige Hollister from Vantage Group Realty. I'm here to take the listing photographs. Your son Darnell arranged—" "I am aware of what my son arranged," I said. My voice was calm. I was not angry. I was simply a woman sitting on her porch drinking coffee at 10 o'clock in the morning. "However, I need to tell you that the listing agreement is void." Paige's smile faded completely. "I'm sorry." I held up the deed. It was unfolded now, visible, the important details clearly legible. Loretta Mae Simmons, sole owner, 1998, paid in full, September 2011. A non-owner cannot list property. I said, "My son's name is not on this deed. He has no legal authority to list this house. The agreement he signed on Friday is void on its face. My attorney's office sent you a cancellation notice yesterday afternoon. You should check your email." Paige pulled out her phone. Her hands were shaking slightly. She opened her email and I watched her face as she found the message from Vivian Tate's office. The formal notification that the listing agreement was being cancelled. The property was not for sale, and any showing should be postponed immediately. I don't understand, she said quietly. Darnell told me. He said he had your authorization. He said you had agreed. He lied, I said, not unkindly. Just a statement of fact. Or he believed his own version of events so completely that he thought his intention was the same as my permission. Either way, the result is the same. The listing is void. There is no sale. Paige stood there on my porch for another moment, trying to process. She looked at the deed in my hand. She looked at the house behind me, the one Darnell had tried to stage and list and sell without my knowledge or consent. She looked at me, a woman in her 60s sitting peacefully in a wicker chair, drinking coffee, completely unmoved by the chaos her son had created. I'm very sorry, Paige said finally. I should have verified the authorization more carefully. That's on me. I'll withdraw the listing immediately and send you the formal documentation. Thank you, I said. She walked back to her car. She did not take any photographs. She did not set up any equipment or walk through the house assessing sightlines and light exposure. She simply got back into her silver Lexus and she drove away from my house and out of this story, leaving behind only the faint smell of her expensive perfume and the dust her tires kicked up on the asphalt. I watched her go. I watched until her car turned the corner at the end of Magnolia Drive. Then I turned to Miss Estelle, who was standing on her own porch next door, the way she had been standing there on Sunday morning when all of this started. The azalea bushes are looking good this year, I called to her. They are, Miss Estelle agreed, and she came down her porch steps to lean on the fence between our properties. You know, I was thinking about what you said last year about moving them, about replanting them closer to the house so you could see them from the kitchen window. I was thinking about that too, I said. Maybe this spring. Maybe I'll have someone come out and help me decide the best location. I could help, Miss Estelle said. I know someone who does landscaping work, does good work, doesn't charge much. That would be nice, I said. And just like that, we resumed the conversation we had been having the Sunday. All of this started. The normal conversation. The one about flowers and bushes and the ordinary work of maintaining a property and a life. The conversation that said, the world did not end. The sky did not fall. Life continued. And in that continuity was a kind of victory that required no announcement. Wednesday afternoon, a certified letter arrived from Vivian Tate's office. It was addressed to Darnell Simmons, but I knew what it contained before I saw it. Vivian had told me she would be sending notice of the revised will and the no contest clause, and all the legal machinery that would make it clear to my son that he had made a choice, and the choice had consequences. The letter sat in my mailbox for an hour before I took it out. I did not open it. It was not my letter to open. It was his, a message from his mother's attorney telling him that his inheritance was still his, but only if he chose not to pursue the path he had started down. Thursday morning, Camille Price left Darnell's apartment. She did this with the kind of efficiency that suggested she had been thinking about it for some time, maybe since Sunday dinner, maybe since before that. She packed 4 suitcases, not all of her things, just enough to make a point. She left a note that I would later hear about from someone who heard from someone else who knew someone in her building. The note said, I cannot ask you to betray your mother. I cannot love you and ask you to do that. I'm going back to Atlanta to stay with my sister for a while. We need to talk about what comes next. Camille. And with that, the relationship that had been the engine driving Darnell's desperation fell apart. The financial pressure that had been building toward the house and the inheritance and the conservatorship petition, that pressure evaporated the moment Camille walked out with 4 suitcases and a note. There was no mortgage down payment to secure anymore. There was no girlfriend waiting for him to liquidate his mother's assets. There was just a man in an apartment that cost $2,100 a month, and a choice that was now starkly clear. File the petition and lose everything, or stand down and keep what his mother was still willing to give him. Renata called on Friday. She was crying, but quietly. The kind of tears that come from finally understanding something I have been avoiding for a long time. "Mama, I'm sorry," she said. "I'm sorry I didn't stand up to him sooner. I'm sorry I let myself pretend this was not happening." "You sent me the email," I said. "That was what mattered. You saw what was wrong, and you told me. That was enough." "It shouldn't have taken me so long," Renata said. "No," I agreed. "It shouldn't have. But you are understanding it now, and that is what matters." The following Sunday, I went back to Shiloh Baptist. I sat in the same pew I always sat in, 2 rows behind Corrine, and I listened to the sermon about grace and forgiveness and the work of carrying forward the things that matter. The pastor did not know what had happened in my life that week. Nobody in the congregation knew except Corinne and Miss Estelle and Vivian Tate and the handful of people these events had touched in small ways. But I sat there and I understood that the story was over. The decisive moment had passed. What remained was simply life, the ordinary allsurum. Daily work of living in a house you own, sitting at a table you paid for, eating food you have chosen to prepare. That Monday, Darnell called. He had received the certified letter. He had read the revised will. He had done the math on what he would lose if he pursued the conservatorship petition. And he had come to the only reasonable conclusion available to him. "Mama," he said, and his voice was very small, "I want to withdraw the petition. I want to apologize for everything I have done. I was wrong. I was trying to control you, and I was wrong." I listened to him say these things, and I did not soften. I did not tell him that it was all right, or that I forgave him, or that we could move past this. What I said was very simple. "You have a choice," I told him. "You can accept your inheritance under the terms of my original will, approximately $400,000 to $6,000, and we can work toward rebuilding whatever relationship we can salvage. Or you can pursue the legal action you have already begun, and you will receive nothing. Those are your only 2 choices. What you cannot do is both. You cannot file a petition claiming I am incompetent and then expect me to include you in my will. Those 2 things cannot coexist." "I understand," Darnell said. "Do you?" I asked. "Do you understand that you tried to take my autonomy? Do you understand that you tried to take my house? Do you understand that your mother is not someone to be managed?" There was a long silence. "Yes," he said finally. "I understand." "Good," I said. "Then you know what you have to do." He withdrew the petition the next day. He sent a formal letter to the attorney who had drafted it, requesting that it be dismissed and never filed. He sent me a letter, not an email, but a handwritten letter on actual paper, apologizing for what he had done and asking whether we could perhaps have dinner sometime. Just to talk. I put that letter on the counter next to the church bulletin that had been sitting there all week. The one from the Sunday when this all began. I did not throw it away. I also did not respond immediately. Some things require time. That Friday, I sat down at my kitchen table, the same table where Darnell had slid the listing agreement across the cloth just a week earlier, and I opened a new will. Not the one with the no contest clause. Not the one drafted in crisis and anger, but a new one, with a clearer head and a steadier hand. I left the $50,000 to Shiloh Baptist. I left Renata her share, the amount that had been quietly doubled. And I left Darnell what I had originally intended to leave him, knowing now that he had made a choice. And that choice would determine whether he could live with himself and with me going forward. But the deed I kept exactly where it was. In my name alone, that was not going to change. The burnt orange Buick still sat in the driveway. I still drove it to church on Sundays and to the grocery store on Saturdays and to the farmer's market when I wanted good yams and good tomatoes, and the feeling of being part of a community that knew who I was and valued what I had built. The house still stood on Magnolia Drive. The same brick colonial with the slightly crooked doors and the foundation that had settled, and the roof I had replaced, and the kitchen where I still cooked the meals that fed my family and my friends and the people I loved. Miss Estelle and I began planning the Azalea relocation that spring. We found a landscaper who did good work and didn't charge much, and together the three of us decided that the bushes would look best planted just outside the kitchen window, where I could see them from the sink while I was washing dishes, where their pink blooms could remind me every April and May that things grow if you tend them properly, and that some things, the things that truly matter, cannot be rushed or forced or taken away by someone who mistakes your patience for weakness. I was still in my house, still at my table, still exactly where I had chosen to be, and exactly